Welcome to the video lecture in which we will examine Scheffler's three models of teaching and learning as outlined in the reading Philosophical Models of Teaching by Israel Scheffler. Today's discussion will focus on the following four core questions. As a teacher, I need to think about what type of learning I want to achieve and how best to get there. So we need to understand what type of learning is there for me to choose from. And what does each type of learning entail? Are there particular elements or criteria that separate one type of learning from another? And once I've identified the type of learning that I wish to achieve, I have to figure out what the methods are that help me best achieve it, both in terms of what it requires of me and what it requires of my students. Today, we will think about the three models of teaching outlined by the philosopher Israel Scheffler. Israel Scheffler is a prominent philosopher of education and philosopher of science. As you read through today's article, you'll notice a lot of conversations around how the brain works, how language works to help us understand our world in order to develop knowledge. Scheffler was really interested in exploring how we learn and how the brain processes information so as to gain knowledge as a way to help shape what education should look like. He taught at Harvard University until 1992. So Scheffler generally argues that the goal of all teaching is the acquisition or creation of knowledge. Throughout the article, he talks about knowledge in very different ways. And in this regard, it connects to the field of philosophy called epistemology that examines the theory of knowledge. What makes knowledge? What types of knowledge do we have? And how do we get to understanding that different types of knowledge? So embedded within the readings, there are three different places in which knowledge can occur. And each one aligns with one of the three models of learning outlined in this presentation. The first one that aligns with the insight model of learning and teaching is the belief that knowledge exists within the world and that experts learn about that knowledge that exists and transfers what they've learned to other people through communication. Another theory of knowledge is that knowledge actually doesn't exist external to people out in the real world, but is instead created and developed internally by an individual through their personal experiences, somewhat like the scientific method. And the third model of knowledge thinks of knowledge as being socially constructed. That is, it's not up to the individual to figure out what is true about the world, but that knowledge is constructed in dialogue and rational practices with other people. Throughout the article, you'll also notice different words being thrown around as being equivalent to knowledge. And it is important to think about what you think knowledge is and what type of knowledge teachers should be focusing on in the classroom. The 5 general categories, as outlined in the reading today, is knowledge as information gathering, or understanding facts, or knowledge as the development of a theory or a personal belief. And then lastly, knowledge as core principles of truth that explain universal realities in the world. Depending on how you understand knowledge and what it is, will influence how you think we best should get there. Scheffler does want to say, regardless of what types of knowledge you're focusing on and where you think knowledge comes from, any type of teaching has these two general things in common. There has to be the intention for the teacher to have the learner learn something, and then there actually has to be the engagement in the activity of teaching and learning itself. Scheffler does state at the beginning of the article that he thinks good teaching, requires that the teacher must intend to respect the student in which they are engaging with. And he does suggest that the criteria outlined in the impression model of teaching does not meet this requirement. That is, in the impression model of teaching, we are not respecting a student's intellectual integrity or capacity for independent judgment because we are imposing what we know onto them and not allowing them to determine whether they think it's true or to organize it in their own particular way or for them to discover or develop their own knowledge. We will see that this idea of allowing student to have agency, for a student and a teacher to have the capacity to gain knowledge in dialogue with one another, does happen in the other two models of education, the insight model and the rule model. What I want to stress here is that Israel Scheffler believes that teaching and learning requires more than a completion of a particular number of steps or any robotic actions done by either the teacher or student, but instead insists that both parties need to be engaging one another genuinely in the development of and understanding of knowledge. This means that teaching and learning cannot happen in a space that is highly controlled, where what is learned and how we learn it is dictated so as to not allow for particular types of questions or particular types of content exploration. As we move throughout this course, you'll think about how this type of controlled environment is much like an indoctrination type of environment, and how indoctrination as a form of learning is not possible in the rule model of learning outlined in today's presentation. Essentially, Scheffler believes that knowledge rests on experience, and it is through communication, reflection, and rational evaluation that we come to understand what we are told, able to apply what we have told to the world, testing it out so as to come to accept what we are told is true, and being able to rationally justify it to ourselves and others, and being able to repeat the cycle again so as to apply it correctly and communicate it so that others can learn too. When thinking about the methods in which we can go about meeting these different models of learning, it will depend on, of course, what we think the knowledge is and how we best get to that types of knowledge, whether we think of it as information and facts, whether we think it as theories or beliefs, or whether we think of it as rationalized principles or universalized truths. In the impression model of teaching and learning, the method in which students will engage in is learning from others, that is, their teacher or their textbook. In the insight model of education, you will see students engaging in hands-on experiences where a teacher may prompt or ask questions in order to promote students learning personally from their experiences so as to have an insight into what is true about the world. And in the rule model of learning, you'll see a combination of both the insight model and the impression model, in which students are learning some facts and informations from the experts or from the field more broadly, that they apply those facts through hands-on experiences to test them out, like the scientific method, and then spend time reflecting on and reasoning on whether or not what they were told and what happened aligned, in order to develop universalized truths or principles that they can use to apply to both novel situations in the future. So now let's drill down on the three models of teaching outlined in today's article: the impression model, the insight model, and the rule model. The impression model of teaching is one that is predominantly found in today's American education and is very widespread. And while Scheffler is critical of the impression model of education, he does emphasize that it is important for us to have a foundation of knowledge and facts and skills in which for us to build upon in order to test in our experiences and then to rationalize from. So he's not suggesting that we should never have impression models of teaching, but it should not be emphasized or the focus of all schooling. Essentially, in the impression model of teaching, teachers treat students as blank slates or tabula rasa. When we get to the portion of the course where we talk about the banking notion of education, this is pretty much the impression model of teaching, in which the student is expected to know and recall the information that the teacher has drilled and tested and provided to them. In this situation, the teacher has a lot of power in selecting what content the student learns and how they learn it, how that content is organized, and how that content is understood within the context of our lived experiences. Within the impression model of education, teachers focus on developing skills in students that allow them to store and regurgitate the information which they've learned. So you'll see a lot of things like focusing on retention, how to take ideas that they've learned and combine it in order to demonstrate understanding of those ideas, how to represent those ideas in new and different ways, and how to determine what ideas are true and what ideas are false based on the information that was provided to them by the teacher. Generally, Scheffler thinks that this model of teaching is based on a bad conception of knowledge. That is, knowing the facts of the world is not the same thing as truly knowing something. Instead, he believes that knowledge requires the development of theories about what we know, somewhat like the scientific method. Therefore, knowledge cannot exist in a vacuum and must be built upon experience, and not simply the experiences of other people. So, for example, if I were wanting to learn how to ride a bike, and my teacher outlined these are the steps in which you go about riding the bike, I might be able to tell the teacher those steps of riding the bike, but it doesn't mean that I actually understand how to ride the bike. In fact, I might apply those steps to riding the bike for the first time, and I still might fail. In this case, I might be able to explain it to others, but I might not be able to do it to myself. So this moves us into the insight model of education, where we try to build where Scheffler tries to build in this idea of experience as an important part of knowledge generation, or the inciting being having insight into new knowledge, not just information gathered from other people or by external sources. In the insight model of education, essentially knowledge is developed and applied by individuals based on what they know and what is within their reach. In this role of teaching and learning, the teacher is seen as a prompter or a guide who supports each individual student in coming to their own insights about what is true in the world by using particular language and pushing them in particular ways that's unique to the student so that they can actually achieve what the insight is that they need to have as predetermined by the teacher. However, we will see that Scheffler thinks that this is problematic and not a robust enough way of thinking about teaching and learning as producing knowledge. And that is because the insight I gain from my personal experiences, even if guided by an expert, is not always efficient at developing a robust knowledge of what is true in the world. That is, the development of those external principles that can be universalized across situations. So, for example, I might learn about buoyancy by engaging in an activity where I put things into a tub of water and I see what floats and what doesn't float and what contributes to things floating better than others. But without knowing the physics behind why what I'm seeing and experiencing is happening, I might develop a theory that fails to be applied to other similar situations. It might be flawed because I lack the information or facts or the principles that govern buoyancy. In this case, you can see that it might be good for impression and insight models of teaching and learning to be combined, which is where he goes when he talks about his rule theory of education. So essentially, the critique of the insight model of education is that introspection by an individual is not always sufficient at developing robust knowledge. Again, the idea here in the insight model of education is that the student acquires the knowledge himself without it being imposed on by a person in power. And that what this would look like in the classroom is the activity of project-based learning, where students are able to test their ideas, think about the pros and cons, engage in the scientific method in order to make a decision and to understand what has happened in their situation. Now let's move on to the rule model of learning, which Israel Scheffler thinks is the best form of learning that allows for a robust development of knowledge as well as new knowledge. He believes that this model meets his two requirements for the intention about respecting students' autonomy in both being able to decide what to learn and how to learn and to critique what they are learning. Here, the requirement of the teacher is that they are held to the same standards as students in terms of using rational practices in order to engage in the development of knowledge and the revision of knowledge. Here, this teacher is required to help students develop those skills that allow them to engage in critical reflection and conversations with others, and to provide spaces where there can be genuine disagreement so that every individual is able to arrive at their own understanding of what is true and does so within a principled manner that is upheld by reasons and not by other motivating factors such as power dynamics or unchecked beliefs or non-reasons. Within the rule model of teaching and learning, remember there is the suggestion of both the insight and impression model, in the sense that the learner must have some knowledge of the important facts and truths in the world so that they can develop through insights of hands-on experiences the reasoned and universal principles that would allow them to develop true knowledge and understanding of a particular subject or field, so that what they know is true can be applied to new and different situations and still, in fact, be true. In this rule model of teaching and learning, we can see that the power dynamics are not so much focused on the teacher or just the student, but is shared between both the teachers and students. In this case, you might see a classroom where teachers and students are learning together, and where the division between who is teaching and who is learning is not always clear to an outside observer. You might also see a space in which teachers and students are working collaboratively to determine what to learn and how to learn it, where the teacher provides expertise and content subject support as necessary in order to promote the ability for the learner to engage in rational processes, such as deliberation and critical reflection and inquiry, in order to advance their own understanding of a particular subject. Scheffler does not provide any clear critiques of the rule model within education in his article, and so I would encourage you to think about what might be problematic about this conception of learning. Is it requiring too much of the teacher or the student? Is it practical? Should it look different for different students in different subjects or at different ages? In each one of these models, there's different views of what it means for something to be known or for a person to have knowledge, whether that means being able to recite facts, whether it means to be able to construct my own understanding through my personal experiences, or if it means being able to use what is known in order to develop theories that allow me to create principles that are universalized within that field of knowledge. Within these three models of teaching, there are also psychological elements in terms of what is mentally required of both the teacher and student. And then lastly, there's a normative judgment within the article that examines what makes for the best type of learning or the best type of knowledge that's focused on, in Scheffler's idea, on a student's agency and ability to become autonomous in the world and to exercise their freedom and their ability to critically reason.